I want you to close your eyes and transport yourself back in time for just a second.
Mm.
Picture the exact sensory details here. You are at a childhood sleepover.
Oh, yeah. The classic sleepover.
Right. It is the middle of the night, way past everyone's bedtime. And the entire house has settled into that heavy, creeping quiet.
Mm-hmm.
You are standing barefoot on the cold tile of this cramped, windowless bathroom. And the only light in the room is coming from a single flickering candle that's sitting precariously on the edge of the porcelain sink.
The tension is already building.
Exactly. The smell of the extinguished match is still hanging in the air. And there you are, just staring at your own dimly lit reflection in the mirror. Your heart is hammering against your ribs. It is practically vibrating in your chest because your friends just double dared you to do the one thing you were explicitly told never to do.
By older siblings, by playground rumors, by everybody.
Yeah, exactly. So you take a shaky, deep breath, you lock eyes with your own reflection in the glass, and you start chanting a name.
It really is. It's the ultimate childhood rite of passage.
Mm-hmm.
The absolute primal terror of the mirror in the dark. It taps into something so fundamentally human.
And you are standing there, knuckles white, just waiting for the glass to spiderweb and crack. Or, for a rotting hand to reach out and grab your collar. Or for this horrifying, blood-soaked face to suddenly materialize right behind your left shoulder.
Yeah, the anticipation is the worst part.
It is. And we are talking, of course, about the legend of Bloody Mary, which is arguably the most pervasive, enduring urban legend in the modern world. But today, we are going completely beyond the bathroom mirror.
Way beyond it.
Because the stack of sources we are pulling from today is genuinely astonishing. We have transcripts from historical documentaries detailing the intimate, brutal daily life of royal lineages. We have deep cultural analysis on the evolution of folklore. And maybe most surprisingly, we have incredible clinical research from the Smithsonian on the actual neuroscience behind it.
Right, the biological, optical mechanics of why you see what you see in the dark.
Exactly.
Which perfectly frames our mission for this deep dive. We are going to untangle a massive, multi-layered web today. Because you have this bizarre intersection of suburban urban legend, of cutting-edge optical science, and of an incredibly tragic, highly weaponized period of European history.
It's wild how those three things connect.
It really is. Our goal today is to meticulously deconstruct this monster in the mirror. We're going to find out who she really was. And what we're going to discover is how the real documented history, the political survival, the chronic illness, the betrayal, is infinitely more complex and far more heartbreaking than a ghost story kids whisper to scare each other at a summer party.
So what if I told you the monster you saw in the mirror wasn't a demon at all, but rather a biological glitch in your own visual cortex, combined with the generational trauma of an abused Tudor queen?
It completely changes how you view the legend.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can get to the historical reality, we have to establish the anatomy of the legend itself. We need to look at who people actually think they are summoning when they stand in that dark room. And diving into the folklore sources, what immediately jumps out is how wildly inconsistent the mechanics of this ritual are.
Yeah, the regional variations are fascinating. You would think a ritual this famous would have a codified set of rules, right?
You would think so, yeah.
But the core elements are really the only constants. The mirror, the sensory deprivation of the darkness, and the vocal chanting. Depending on what geographical region you grew up in or what decade you were born into, the parameters wildly fluctuate.
Right.
Some folklore dictates you only have to chant her name 3 times. Others insist it has to be exactly 13 times. And you have to spin in a circle between each chant.
Oh, wow. 13 times seems exhausting when you're terrified.
It really does. Some say you have to hold the candle at a specific angle, or that you have to say the name with increasing intensity, like starting with a whisper and ending in a full-throated scream.
As if you are physically hauling something across the threshold of the glass.
Exactly, yeah.
And the expected outcome is completely erratic, too. When I was a kid in the 90s, the definitive rumor was that if you performed the ritual correctly, Bloody Mary would physically breach the room.
Oh, the violent version.
Yeah, she would reach through the mirror and scratch your eyes out, or she would somehow magically fuse the bathroom door shut from the inside, just trapping you in the pitch black with her forever.
That is terrifying.
Right. But looking at the older anthropological data in our sources, the original intent of mirror rituals wasn't always a slasher movie scenario.
Far from it, actually. Historically, mirror scrying was deeply linked to divination. And specifically, it was focused on the marital anxieties of young women.
Okay, marital anxieties.
Right. In the rural iterations of the ritual, dating back a century or more, the expectation was that if a young woman performed it correctly, the dark surface of the mirror would briefly illuminate,
Oh, interesting.
and it would reveal the face of her future spouse. You would stare into the void and see the man you were destined to spend your life with.
Which sounds oddly quaint and romantic until you get to the horrifying caveat. Because the folklore explicitly states that if you were not destined to get married, meaning, if the universe had determined you were going to die young before ever finding a partner, the mirror would not show a man's face.
Right.
It would show the visage of the Grim Reaper, or a decaying skull.
Which is so grim. The mirror acts as the ultimate unforgiving arbiter of fate. It either grants you the promise of a long, socially acceptable life, or it bluntly predicts your own premature demise.
It is a terrifying psychological gamble.
It really is. But the most compelling part of this folklore isn't just the mechanics of the ritual. It is the identity of the entity supposedly executing that judgment.
Right, who is actually in the glass?
Exactly. When we cross-reference the historical and cultural analysis in our sources, there are four primary suspects. Four vastly different women, ranging from local outcasts to international monarchs who have been slapped with the real Bloody Mary label.
The lineup is genuinely wild. We need to look at how these different narratives bled into each other because they range from village hysteria to modern teen culture. The first candidate the sources outline takes us back to the stark, unforgiving winters of the 1700s, to a woman named Mary Broadsworth.
Right, Mary Broadsworth. To understand her, you have to understand the isolation and superstition of an 18th century rural village. The story asserts she was a solitary woman living in a dilapidated cottage on the edge of the deep woods in the 1740s.
Like the classic witch trope.
Exactly. She was essentially the local cunning woman, known for brewing herbal tinctures, poultices, and remedies. But then the village suffers an inexplicable tragedy. Young girls begin vanishing without a trace.
Oh.
Yeah. And in a panicked pre-industrial society that doesn't understand forensics or serial crime, the collective anxiety demands a scapegoat. The blame almost instantly targets the marginalized outcast living on the periphery of their society.
Naturally.
So they accuse Mary Broadsworth of witchcraft, theorizing she is abducting the girls for dark rituals.
And the mob mentality takes over completely at that point. According to the legend, the townspeople bypassed the courts. The lore states they dragged her from her cottage and extrajudicially executed her.
It's brutal.
The variations are awful. Some claim she was hanged from a tree in the village square. Others insist she was dragged into the woods and buried alive. But the crucial detail that links her to our mirror is that before she succumbed, she allegedly spat out a curse upon the town.
The classic dying curse.
Yes. The myth claims her vengeful spirit became untethered and bound itself to reflective surfaces, waiting in a state of suspended fury to be summoned so she could continue her revenge against the youth of the world. It is the absolute prototypical colonial witch hunt narrative.
It really is. It operates as a perfect vessel for the societal fear of the dangerous woman. But our second suspect is vastly more grandiose.
Oh, this one is wild.
She is deeply anchored in documented history, though surrounded by a swirling vortex of gruesome myth. We are talking about the Hungarian noblewoman, Elizabeth Bathory.
The Blood Countess. This is where the sheer brutality of the lore really spikes.
Right. Bathory is frequently cited in popular culture as one of the most prolific female serial killers in human history. Now, we must note that historians fiercely debate how much of her story is verified fact versus a politically motivated smear campaign by her rivals to seize her vast lands.
Right. Always keep the political context in mind.
Exactly. But the legend, the narrative that actually feeds the modern Bloody Mary myth, is horrifying. The lore claims that in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Bathory lured hundreds of young, virgin peasant girls to her castle and tortured them to death.
And the motive is just, it's so specific.
It is. She supposedly believed that draining their blood and physically bathing in it would halt the aging process, preserving her youth and beauty indefinitely. Ultimately, the crown intervened, she was arrested, and she was walled up inside a windowless room in her own castle until she died.
You can see exactly how the DNA of her legend spliced into the Bloody Mary ritual. You have the literal blood aspect, obviously.
Yes, very literally.
But more importantly, you have this manic, monstrous obsession with physical appearance and vanity. The desire to preserve one's reflection at any violent cost seamlessly merges into a myth about a monster living inside a reflection. Which brings us perfectly to the third suspect, because vanity is the absolute beating heart of her narrative, too.
It really is.
And the suspect is much more recent. She originates from mid-century America around the 1960s. Her name is Mary Worthington.
Right, the Mary Worthington tale. It's a fascinating sociological artifact because it feels like a deliberately constructed modern ghost story, perfectly tailored for the rise of American suburban teen culture. According to the lore, Mary Worthington was a stunningly beautiful, affluent young woman who was completely consumed by her own vanity. She would spend hours locked in her room, endlessly admiring her reflection. Her physical beauty was the totality of her identity.
But the era of the automobile provides the tragedy here. She gets into a horrific, mangled car crash. She survives the wreck, but her face is irreparably destroyed.
Which is her worst nightmare.
Exactly. The injuries and scarring are so profound that her family and her attending surgeons issue a strict mandate. She is forbidden from looking in a mirror. They actually go through her home and remove or cover every single reflective surface, knowing that the psychological trauma of seeing her mutilated face will absolutely shatter her fragile psyche.
But the compulsion is a disease. The narrative states that one night, driven mad by the need to see herself, she sneaks into a part of the house she wasn't supposed to be in, finds a hidden mirror, and confronts her reflection.
Oh, man.
The shock, the grief, and the sudden realization of her lost identity completely fracture her mind. In a fit of absolute despair, she shatters the glass, takes a jagged shard from the wreckage, and ends her own life.
That's so dark.
And because she died in a state of violent agony staring into the broken mirror, her spirit is permanently trapped in the glass. The lore warns that if you call her name, she will manifest, furious and hideously disfigured, ready to physically inflict her suffering onto anyone who dares to look upon her.
You really cannot miss the heavy-handed moralizing here.
No, not at all.
Both Bathory and Worthington serve as these deeply misogynistic cautionary tales about female vanity. Society seems to be using these myths to wag a finger at young women, essentially saying, if you are too obsessed with your appearance, if you stare at yourself in the glass for too long, the mirror itself will eventually consume and destroy you.
It is a profound observation. In the realm of folklore, mirrors are almost never just passive panes of glass. They are portals to the underworld. They are merciless judges of moral character. They strip away the facade and reflect the decaying truth of the soul.
Wow. Yeah.
But here is where we pivot, because while Broadsworth's witchcraft, Bathory's bloodlust, and Worthington's shattered vanity are all deeply compelling narrative threads that undoubtedly contributed atmospheric details to the modern sleepover dare, the actual historical name Bloody Mary belongs to our fourth suspect.
The main event.
Exactly. The woman who universally holds the title in the history books, Queen Mary I of England, famously known as Mary Tudor.
The 16th century sovereign. The monarch whose entire historical legacy has been boiled down to one single horrifying fact, burning hundreds of religious heretics alive at the stake.
She is the historical anchor for the moniker. But the reason our source material today is so critical is that it demands we look behind the cartoonish villainy of that nickname. If we are genuinely going to determine if Mary Tudor earned the title of Bloody Mary, we cannot simply analyze the violent twilight of her reign. We have to rewind the tape.
We have to go back to the beginning.
Yes, we have to go back to the very beginning of her life. Because the bloodthirsty tyrant everyone thinks they know, the one practically born with a torch in her hand, is a complete historical fabrication.
And this is exactly where the narrative completely subverts everything you think you know. When you hear Bloody Mary, you assume she was a born sociopath, someone inherently cruel and sadistic from childhood, but the historical documents paint a portrait that is almost aggressively opposite to that. Let's start at the beginning. Let's go to the year 1516, the year Mary Tudor is born.
Right, so in 1516, Mary arrives as the child of the formidable King Henry VIII of England and his first wife, the fiercely intelligent Spanish princess, Queen Catherine of Aragon. And for the first chapter of her life, her existence is the absolute zenith of a royal fairy tale. She is the undeniable golden child of the English court.
She really was.
And to understand how precious she was, you have to realize that Catherine of Aragon had endured a grueling, heartbreaking series of pregnancies, stillbirth, and infants who died within days. Mary was the sole miraculous child of their union to survive infancy.
Because she is this lone survivor, this miracle baby, her parents just shower her with an incomprehensible level of affection. Her christening isn't just a ceremony, it is a lavish, state-sponsored spectacle. The records show she is deeply, genuinely loved by both Henry and Catherine, and she is openly adored by the English populace. She is paraded around as the quintessential, perfect little princess of the realm.
And she possessed a formidable intellect. The primary sources universally note that she was a multi-talented prodigy. She was given an elite, rigorous education, far beyond what was typical even for noblewomen.
Which is saying something.
It is. And the most crucial detail here, the one that shapes her entire worldview, is that her mother, Catherine, personally ensured she was instructed in Latin.
Okay, we have to pause here. Because in the 16th century, Latin was not just an academic subject, it was entirely coded as a masculine language. It was the language of international diplomacy, of complex legal treatises, and of high theology.
So Catherine wasn't just giving her daughter a rigorous hobby. By demanding she master Latin, Catherine was actively, deliberately grooming Mary for ultimate power.
That is so cool.
Right. Because Henry had not yet produced a male heir, Catherine possessed the foresight to realize that Mary might eventually have to rule England in her own right. She was arming Mary with the intellectual tools required to fulfill what was universally viewed by European society as the most fundamentally masculine of all roles, a sovereign ruler.
But even though Henry is constantly bragging about his daughter's brilliance to foreign ambassadors, he is still a 16th century king. And in his world, political capital always supersedes paternal affection.
Always.
The way he leverages his toddler daughter as a geopolitical pawn is staggering. The documents show that when Mary was barely 2 years old, Henry formally betrothed her to the Dauphin of France, who was also a babbling toddler. They literally arranged for these babies to exchange a tiny, jewel-encrusted engagement ring to seal an international treaty.
It was pure, unadulterated statecraft disguised as a holy sacrament. And when shifting European alliances caused that French treaty to collapse, Henry didn't miss a beat. 4 years later, when Mary is just 6 years old, he betroths her again. This time, he promises his 6-year-old daughter to her own cousin, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V.
And Charles was 22 years old at the time, a 6-year-old girl legally bound to a 22-year-old emperor.
It is entirely jarring to our modern moral sensibilities, but it perfectly illustrates Mary's dual existence. She was a deeply cherished daughter, yes, but she was simultaneously the most valuable, tradable commodity on Henry's geopolitical chessboard.
Wow.
She was eventually sent to the borders of Wales, endowed with the title of Princess of Wales, holding court and acting as the literal, physical embodiment of royal authority in the region. She had immense status, she was enveloped in love, and her future as a towering European figure was practically written in stone.
Until the bottom drops out of her reality in the most spectacular, catastrophic way imaginable. The turning point of her life, the singular moment that lays the foundation for the Bloody Mary we know, arrives. And it isn't a foreign invasion or a plague. It is simply her father deciding he desires another woman.
Anne Boleyn. The gravitational pull of Anne Boleyn entering the Tudor court is the catalyst that systematically and ruthlessly detonates Mary's entire existence.
Let's walk through the mechanics of this, because it isn't just a messy divorce, it is a societal earthquake. Henry becomes utterly infatuated with Anne Boleyn, and he desperately wants a male heir. To marry Anne, he needs to dispose of Catherine. He needs the Pope to grant an annulment, effectively erasing his first marriage.
Right.
But due to incredibly complex European politics involving Catherine's powerful family, the Pope flatly refuses to grant it. So Henry, possessing an ego the size of the sun, doesn't just accept defeat. His solution is to literally tear up the fabric of reality for every single person in his country.
He initiates the English Reformation. To secure his annulment, King Henry completely severs the entire nation of England from the Roman Catholic Church. He exiles the Pope's authority, dismantles centuries of religious infrastructure, and officially declares himself the supreme head of the newly formed Church of England.
It's a massive power grab.
Exactly. In one sweeping legislative stroke, he grants his own divorce, legally exiles Catherine of Aragon from the court, and marries Anne Boleyn.
The fallout for Mary is not just a downgrade, it is complete annihilation of her identity. Henry strips her of the Princess of Wales title. He goes to Parliament and officially declares Mary an illegitimate child, legally establishing that his marriage to her mother was a sin in the eyes of God and never lawful to begin with.
She is instantaneously transformed from the revered heir to the throne into a social pariah, a bastard. And Henry's cruelty doesn't stop at titles. When Anne Boleyn successfully gives birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, Henry forces Mary to move into Elizabeth's household and physically serve as a lady-in-waiting to the new infant.
We need a way to understand the sheer dizzying vertigo of this. It is impossible to overstate. Imagine you wake up one morning and the government has outlawed gravity. The fundamental laws of the universe you were raised to believe in have been made illegal by your own father.
That's a great way to put it.
And socially. You go from being the CEO in waiting, groomed by the smartest people in the world, to suddenly being told you are a fraud. Your beloved mentor, your mother, is fired and banished, and then the boss forces you to fetch the coffee and clean up after his new mistress's newborn baby. All while you have to stand in the corner and watch this baby receive the wealth, the titles, and the fatherly love that was ripped away from you.
The humiliation is just endless.
And the most twisted detail, Henry explicitly bans Mary from ever seeing or speaking to her mother again.
We have to zoom out and look at the existential stakes of this paradigm shift. We cannot view this reformation through the secular lens of a modern, messy celebrity divorce. For a person living in the 16th century, religion was not a weekend community activity.
No, not at all.
The Catholic Church was the hospital, it was the welfare system, it recorded your birth, it managed your death, and it was the undisputed arbiter of your eternal soul. When Henry breaks with Rome, it is a cosmic catastrophe. For Mary, who was raised by her Spanish mother to be a fervently devout Catholic, this new Protestant Reformation isn't just a political headache. It is an active, violent threat to her immortal soul.
And practically speaking, her faith is the only tether she has left to the mother she is forbidden to see.
Precisely. Clinging to her Catholicism becomes her ultimate act of defiance. It is the core of her psychological identity. If she bends the knee and accepts Henry's new Protestant church, she is legally and spiritually validating the claim that her mother was nothing more than a royal concubine, and she is agreeing that she herself is a worthless, illegitimate byproduct of sin.
So she digs in. She stubbornly refuses to acknowledge the annulment. She refuses to refer to Anne Boleyn as queen, and she absolutely refuses to attend Protestant services.
Good for her.
Right. Because of this, she unwittingly becomes a beacon of hope, a symbol of dangerous rebellion for all the conservative factions in England who despise Anne Boleyn and secretly remain loyal to the Pope.
But maintaining that defiance requires an unimaginable toll on her mind and body. This is where we have to transition from her public social humiliation to her deeply private, profound physical suffering. Because if you want to understand the psychological architecture of the woman who would later burn heretics, you have to understand the biological reality of her daily life during her 20s.
Right. The sources dive deeply into her medical history, and reading it is just harrowing. While all of this intense political abuse is happening, Mary's body is actively turning against her. The royal physicians of the Tudor era vaguely referred to her agonizing bouts of illness as her usual troubles or her old disease. But modern medical historians, carefully analyzing the detailed contemporary descriptions of her symptoms, strongly believe Mary suffered from a devastating form of endometriosis, specifically presenting as severe dysmenorrhea.
For context, endometriosis is an often excruciating condition where tissue similar to the lining of the uterus goes outside the uterus, attaching to other organs. It triggers chronic, intense inflammatory responses.
Horrible pain.
The historical sources document that Mary's pain was not just uncomfortable, it was utterly debilitating. We are talking about severe, radiating pelvic cramping that would frequently leave her bedridden for days or weeks at a time. And it was accompanied by drastic, intense hormonal fluctuations that pushed her into deep, crushing periods of melancholia and clinical depression.
And we have to remember the era. It is the 1500s. There's no surgical intervention. There's no targeted hormone therapy. There is not even basic effective pain management beyond perhaps some herbal tea or wine. She is simply expected to endure the agony in silence.
And modern medical science tells us definitively that profound psychological stress is a massive aggravating trigger for autoimmune and inflammatory conditions like endometriosis. So look at her environment.
It's a pressure cooker.
Exactly. She's an isolated teenager, cut off from her mother, publicly stripped of her dignity, and living in perpetual waking terror that her notoriously temperamental father might suddenly decide her religious defiance is treasonous and send her to the executioner's block. Her nervous system is locked in a permanent state of fight or flight.
And her body absorbs that terror. The historical records show a direct correlation. She suffered a particularly nasty, prolonged flare-up of this agonizing physical pain right around the exact time Henry finalized the banishment of her mother. Her physical agony is erupting concurrently with her emotional devastation. She is literally a young woman living in constant, untreated, invisible pain.
And just when you think the situation cannot deteriorate further, 1536 arrives. Two seismic events occur in rapid succession. First, her mother, Catherine of Aragon, dies in exile, presumably of cancer. Mary is barred from visiting her on her deathbed and barred from attending her funeral.
Which is just unspeakably cruel.
It really is. She is swallowed by grief. But mere months later, the political wheel violently turns. Anne Boleyn, the woman Mary holds entirely responsible for the destruction of her family, falls from Henry's favor, is arrested on trumped-up charges of treason, and is beheaded.
And as a reader, you instinctively think, okay, the villain of Mary's story is dead. This has to be the turning point where Mary gets a reprieve. Mary herself even writes these desperate, hopeful letters to her father, assuming that with Anne gone, Henry will soften, welcome her back to court, and they can be a loving family again.
But she fundamentally underestimated Henry's ruthlessness. He does not soften. Instead, he writes back demanding absolute, total capitulation. He sends his most intimidating ministers to surround her, telling Mary that if she ever wants to see the inside of the court again, she must put her physical signature on a specific legal document, the Oath of Supremacy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. She must officially, publicly declare herself a bastard, acknowledge her mother's marriage as incestuous and void, and recognize Henry, not the Pope, as the supreme head of the church. She must formally reject her God.
Stop and think about the psychological torture of that demand. What happens to a human mind when the only path to physical survival requires you to sign a piece of parchment that permanently erases your mother's honor, invalidates your own right to exist, and in your deeply held belief system guarantees your soul will burn in hell for eternity?
It's an impossible choice.
And this is not an idle threat. The sources explicitly state Henry was out for blood. If she refused, she would be tried for treason. He had just severed the head of his wife. Executing a defiant daughter would not cause him to lose sleep. The phrase used in the source material perfectly captures the terrifying reality. For the Tudors, family drama could be deadly.
It was a hostage situation. And it wasn't solely her own life hanging in the balance.
Yeah.
Henry's ministers made it explicitly clear that if Mary continued to defy the king, Henry would round up and execute Mary's closest friends, servants, and political supporters.
He used her friends against her.
Exactly. So trapped in a corner, isolated and terrified, she breaks. She signs the document. Against every fiber of her conscience, against the memory of her beloved mother, she signs the paper to save her own life and the lives of her loyalists.
She survives, yes. She is allowed back into the royal rotation, but the cost of that signature is her sanity and her inner peace. The historical sources note that from that day forward, she was plagued by an immense, crushing, suffocating guilt. She genuinely believed she had betrayed the Almighty and spat on her mother's grave. Her resentment turns inward, and she becomes a deeply bitter, hardened survivor.
Which leads us to the ultimate question. How does this traumatized, chronically ill, guilt-ridden woman eventually seize the ultimate power in England? Because time marches on, and in 1547, the towering tyrant Henry VIII finally dies.
But the crown doesn't go to our surviving anti-heroine. It goes to a child. Henry's son from his third marriage, Edward VI, who is only 9 years old when he takes the throne.
Correct. Henry's desperate quest for a male heir resulted in Edward. But a 9-year-old cannot govern a kingdom. Edward's reign is entirely controlled by a council of fiercely, radically Protestant advisors who want to push the Reformation even further than Henry did.
So the pendulum swings even further away from Mary.
Precisely. Almost instantly, Mary's devout Catholicism makes her public enemy number one to her little brother's government. She is harassed, her private masses are threatened with intervention, and she is once again living under the shadow of state persecution.
But Edward is remarkably fragile. The sources indicate he was a sickly child, and he contracts a fatal illness, widely believed to be a severe pulmonary infection, possibly tuberculosis, and dies at the incredibly young age of 15. However, as he lies dying, Edward is acutely aware of the succession laws. He knows Mary is legally next in line, and he knows with absolute certainty that the moment she gets the crown, she will violently tear down the Protestant church he and his advisors built.
So, in a desperate dying maneuver, Edward attempts to rewrite the legal succession. He drafts a document bypassing his Catholic half-sister Mary entirely, and instead names his fiercely Protestant, highly educated teenage cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as his rightful heir and the next Queen of England.
Yeah, and this triggers one of the most astonishing high-stakes political showdowns in Tudor history. Lady Jane Grey actually assumes the throne. She is proclaimed queen, but her reign lasts for exactly 9 days.
Because Mary Tudor has finally reached her breaking point. After a lifetime of being pushed aside, humiliated, and threatened, she decides she is not going to run or submit ever again. She flees to the countryside and sends out a massive rallying cry. She calls upon her Catholic loyalists, but crucially, she also appeals to the English people who simply believe she is the true, legitimate blood heir of Henry VIII, regardless of their religion.
It's an incredible move.
It is. She mounts an incredibly swift, brilliantly executed, and largely bloodless coup. She marches her massive growing army directly into London. The council collapses in fear, Lady Jane Grey is deposed, locked in the Tower, and later executed. At 37 years old, Mary seizes the throne.
And the reaction from the public is nothing short of euphoric. The sources describe scenes of absolute pandemonium. The people of London wept with joy in the streets. They lit massive bonfires. They set up banquet tables in the alleys. They remembered the beautiful little princess she used to be. They deeply sympathized with the decades of horrific abuse she had suffered, and they were thrilled to see her finally vindicated. She achieved something unprecedented. She was the first female monarch to rule England in her own sovereign right, not merely as the consort of a king.
It was a moment of profound triumph. But the tragedy is that the woman who put the crown on her head was no longer the innocent, forgiving princess the public remembered. She was a woman calcified by trauma, deeply suspicious, profoundly bitter, and fanatically driven by a religious mandate.
Right.
She believed God had spared her life for one singular purpose, to drag England, kicking and screaming if necessary, back to the Catholic Church. But to secure that Catholic future and ensure her reforms outlasted her, she needed to produce a Catholic heir. If she died without a child, the throne would automatically pass to her half-sister Elizabeth, the Protestant daughter of Anne Boleyn.
The ultimate nightmare scenario. So Mary realizes she needs a husband, and she needs one immediately. The clock is loudly ticking on her fertility.
She looks for the most powerful Catholic alliance possible, and she arranges a marriage to Prince Philip II of Spain, tying her fate to her mother's homeland. Now, the interpersonal dynamics of this marriage are staggeringly sad. Mary's 38 years old, Philip is 27, a full 11 years her junior, and the emotional investment is entirely asymmetrical. Mary, who has been starved for genuine affection her entire life, falls hopelessly, utterly in love with him. She adores him.
But Philip approaches this marriage with the cold, clinical detachment of a corporate raider executing a hostile takeover. He is marrying her strictly for the strategic military alliance and access to English naval resources. And the way his inner circle speaks about Mary is just vile. There is this incredibly brutal quote detailed in our sources from one of Philip's closest Spanish confidants. This nobleman is writing a letter praising Philip's stoic dedication to his political duty, specifically noting that Philip was brave enough to sleep with a woman from whom he could expect neither physical pleasure nor satisfaction.
It is breathtakingly cruel. And it wasn't just one confidant. The entire Spanish entourage mocked her relentlessly behind her back. They wrote letters to the continent detailing how the decades of immense mental suffering and the ravages of chronic endometriosis had aged her prematurely. They brutally described her as having a frail, withered structure, thinning white hair, and lacking eyebrows, which is a common symptom of severe prolonged stress.
They just picked her apart.
Completely. They ridiculed her fashion sense. She was a woman desperate to be cherished, legally bound to a man who was visibly repulsed by her mere presence.
But despite the utter lack of warmth or affection, Mary clings to her ultimate mission. She needs to get pregnant. And shortly after the wedding, it seems like her prayers are answered. A miracle occurs. The historical sources outline that Mary stops menstruating. She begins experiencing classic morning sickness. She gains weight, and her abdomen visibly, physically swells. The elite royal physicians examine her and officially declare that the queen is with child.
The wave of relief that washes over the kingdom is immense. Cathedral bells are rung incessantly. Parliament offers prayers of thanksgiving. Inside the palace, the massive machinery of royal birth gears up. A luxurious birthing chamber is sealed and prepared. A beautiful, ornate nursery is carved out. A small army of wet nurses, rockers, and caretakers are hired, paid, and placed on standby. The government even drafts the official, sealed letters announcing the successful birth of the new Catholic heir to the monarchs of Europe, leaving only the specific date and gender blank, ready to be filled in by the scribes the moment the child takes a breath.
Here is where the story shifts from political drama to sheer, devastating psychological horror. The months tick by. 7 months, 8 months, 9 months come and go. Mary is adamant that she can feel the child kicking inside her, but as the 10th and 11th months approach, the whispers start. The courtiers realize the horrific truth. The swelling eventually subsides. There is no baby.
It was a false pregnancy. Now, modern medical historians offer two theories. Given her later death, some suggest her swollen abdomen could have been a massive ovarian tumor. But the widely accepted theory is that Mary experienced a profound episode of pseudocyesis, commonly known as a phantom pregnancy.
I need you to explain the mechanics of pseudocyesis because that is one of the most heartbreaking things the human body can do. How does a woman look and feel 9 months pregnant without a child?
It is the ultimate tragic manifestation of the mind-body connection. A phantom pregnancy occurs when a woman's psychological desire to have a child is so intense and the emotional stakes are so overwhelmingly high that the brain's endocrine system literally tricks the body into mimicking the exact physical symptoms of pregnancy.
That is just wild.
Her pituitary gland likely triggered the release of hormones that halted her cycle, caused her breasts to swell, and induced nausea. Her body, severely traumatized by years of endometriosis, absolutely starved for the affection a child would bring, and buckling under the immense kingdom-altering pressure of securing the Tudor dynasty, simply manufactured the illusion of the one thing she desperately needed.
It is the ultimate cruelty of human biology. A body that so desperately wants to leave a legacy, to finally be loved unconditionally, that it gaslights itself. And the crushing, almost unbelievable reality is that this does not just happen once. This agonizing cycle of false hope, public celebration, and humiliating deflation happens twice during her 5-year reign.
The second phantom pregnancy was the definitive final straw that broke Mary's spirit. It forced her to violently confront the cold, hard reality she had been avoiding. Her childbearing years were definitively biologically over. Her husband, Philip, used the lack of an heir as an excuse to leave England and tend to his territories in Spain, showing barely a shred of sympathy for her agonizing public humiliation. And waiting patiently in the wings, legally next in line for the throne, was the ghost of her past, Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the living embodiment of the woman who destroyed Mary's childhood. And to make it worse, Elizabeth is everything Mary realizes she is not. Elizabeth is young, she is vibrant, she's incredibly charismatic, and she is a steadfast Protestant.
All of the suppressed resentment, the decades of physical agony, the endless public humiliation, the profound grief of the phantom pregnancies, it all boils over into a toxic rage. Mary realizes her grand vision for a restored, permanent Catholic England is slipping through her fingers like sand. In a state of sheer desperation, her religious fervor hardens into a terrifying, lethal fanaticism. Which brings us to the specific actions that permanently sear the nickname Bloody Mary into the history books.
Right, we cannot shy away from this. We have to look at the actual documented facts of her reign, the bloody body count, because this is where the decades of internalized trauma finally manifest into state-sponsored violence.
In her frantic desperation to purge the sickness of Protestantism from England before she dies, Mary initiates a ruthless, systematic campaign of mass executions known as the Marian persecutions. Her chosen method for dealing with religious dissenters is brutal, burning heretics alive at the stake.
And we cannot gloss over the horror of this. Hold on. Because over her brief 5-year reign, she burns roughly 280 to 300 Protestants. And she doesn't do it quietly in a dungeon. She makes it a visceral, terrifying public spectacle. The sources explicitly highlight that her magistrates would force other Protestants to stand in the crowds and watch their peers burn, breathing in the smoke, knowing that they would suffer the exact same agonizing fate if they didn't immediately recant their beliefs.
It was psychological warfare as much as physical.
She showed zero mercy. The records indicate she even burned pregnant women alive if she deemed their theology heretical. It was an absolute, undeniable reign of terror executed in the name of spiritual purification.
You are absolutely right. The sheer horror of burning a human being alive is indefensible, and her actions were undeniably horrific. The suffering she caused was immense. However, if our goal is to truly understand how historical legacies are forged, we cannot view those 300 executions in a vacuum. We have to place them within the incredibly violent context of 16th century statecraft. The analytical question our sources demand we ask is this: why does Mary stand entirely alone in the public consciousness with the prefix bloody?
Okay, I see where you're going. Let's look at the family scorecard because the double standard is honestly staggering. Let's look at her father, King Henry VIII. The man was a butchering tyrant. He executed tens of thousands of people during his reign, tens of thousands. He ripped monasteries apart, he executed his closest advisors, and he famously beheaded 2 of his own wives. Nobody calls him Bloody Henry.
Exactly. And let's look at the golden sister who succeeded her, Queen Elizabeth I. Elizabeth ordered the executions of up to 1,000 Catholic rebels, priests, and Jesuit missionaries who refused to accept her Protestant church. And Elizabeth's methods weren't exactly a gentle slap on the wrist. Many of those Catholics were hanged, drawn, and quartered, an agonizing, prolonged punishment that is arguably even more gruesome and torturous than burning at the stake.
Wait, So if Henry killed tens of thousands of people and Elizabeth executed over 1,000 people in horrific ways, isn't labeling Mary bloody for 300 executions a massive, historically disproportionate PR smear campaign? Doesn't she deserve the title at least a little bit for the burnings, or is this entirely orchestrated by the victors?
She certainly earned a reputation for brutality, but the exclusive nature of the title, bloody, is pure, unadulterated propaganda. The golden rule of history is that it is written by the victors. And Mary Tudor, despite her brief triumph, was ultimately on the losing side of history. In 1558, Mary dies. Her reign was short, disastrous, and painful. She likely succumbed to the very ovarian cancer or complications stemming from her lifelong, untreated endometriosis. The moment she dies, her Catholic vision immediately crumbles. Elizabeth ascends the throne, Protestantism surges back into power, and it permanently becomes the official religion of England.
So the Protestants are the ones who hold the pen. They get to write the textbooks.
Exactly. And they possessed a remarkably effective tool. Just 5 years after Mary's death, in 1563, an exiled Protestant clergyman named John Foxe publishes a massive, sprawling book called Acts and Monuments, which becomes widely known as Foxe's Book of Martyrs. It is an incredibly graphic, highly emotive, detailed account of the Protestants who suffered and died under Mary's reign, but what made it uniquely devastating wasn't just the text, it was the imagery. The book was filled with terrifying, visceral, highly detailed woodcut illustrations of the burnings.
And you have to understand the power of early mass media. This book becomes a runaway, unprecedented bestseller. The historical sources note that the government mandated this book be physically placed in churches right next to the Holy Bible. So you have generations upon generations of English citizens, many of whom were illiterate and relied on the pictures, growing up staring every Sunday at these horrifying, violent woodcuts of Mary's victims burning in agony. It was a masterclass in state-sponsored propaganda.
The psychological damage to her legacy was permanent. Her entire life was curated by the people who defeated her. She was cemented in the global public consciousness as a mad, bloodthirsty zealot, a one-dimensional cartoon villain. And in the process, all of the actual nuanced achievements of her reign were deliberately erased.
Achievements like what? Because she is never credited with anything positive.
During her brief time on the throne, Mary implemented crucial, highly effective financial reforms that stabilized a collapsing Tudor economy. Furthermore, she recognized the island's vulnerability and significantly expanded, funded, and restructured the English Navy. The cruel irony of history is that Mary laid the vital naval groundwork that directly enabled Elizabeth's legendary myth-making victories against the Spanish Armada decades later.
Wow, she actually built the navy that Elizabeth used.
Exactly, but none of that nuance survived the printing press. The moniker Bloody Mary stuck like glue, and the complex, deeply traumatized, chronically ill woman was reduced to a terrifying monster.
Okay, this is a massive paradigm shift, but it brings up a huge lingering question. If Mary Tudor was just a tragic, medically tortured monarch, a woman in pain who was weaponized into a propaganda boogeyman by her sister's government, why do people to this day genuinely claim to see horrifying things in the mirror when they play the Bloody Mary game? If she's not an actual demonic entity, what the hell is happening to people's eyes in those bathrooms?
This is where our source material makes a brilliant pivot from historical analysis to clinical neuroscience, and the explanation is absolutely fascinating. There's a real, scientifically documented biological reason why people see monsters when they stare into a mirror in the dark. In 2010, an Italian vision researcher named Giovanni Caputo decided to empirically test this exact urban legend phenomenon in a laboratory setting.
The science of the mirror hallucination. I need to know exactly how this works. Walk me through the mechanics of the study.
Caputo gathered 50 healthy participants for a clinical trial. The environmental setup was brilliantly simple, mimicking the folklore. He placed them in a dimly lit room. The lighting was calibrated to be roughly equivalent to the illumination provided by a single candle. He sat them in front of a large mirror and gave them one specific instruction: stare deeply and continuously into your own reflection for 10 solid minutes.
10 minutes, just staring at yourself in a dark room. That sounds deeply uncomfortable and anxiety-inducing, even if you don't believe in ghosts.
It is intensely uncomfortable, specifically because of how our visual processing system is biologically wired. What Caputo was testing, and what he successfully documented, is a psychological phenomenon he dubbed the strange face illusion. This illusion is heavily driven by a foundational neurological concept known as Troxler's fading.
Okay, break that down for me. What is Troxler's fading, and how does it create a monster?
Let's look at the mechanics of the human eye and brain. Your peripheral nervous system and your visual cortex are evolutionarily designed to filter out static, unchanging information. Your brain wants to conserve energy to focus on new, potentially dangerous stimuli, like a predator moving in the bushes. When you force yourself to stare at a single fixed point, say the bridge of your nose in a mirror, for an extended period of time, especially in a low-light environment where visual data is already scarce, your brain's neurons literally get fatigued.
They just get tired.
Yes, they get bored by the constant, unchanging visual input. As a result, your visual system starts to selectively ignore, blur, or entirely fade out the peripheral details of your face.
Wait, so your brain just stops processing the edges of your own face? It just deletes the image?
Yeah, exactly. The sensory adaptation kicks in, and the edges of your vision begin to wash out. But here's the critical part. The human brain absolutely despises a vacuum. It hates missing or incomplete information. So when the actual physical visual data of your reflection fades away, your brain panics. It attempts to autofill the blanks using whatever subconscious data expectations or predictive coding it has lying around in your visual cortex. And the results of Caputo's study documenting this autofill process were wildly unsettling.
The statistics in the source material are mind-blowing. Out of the 50 perfectly healthy people in the study, 2/3 of them, over 66%, reported seeing their own face become monstrously distorted. They reported their eyes melting or shifting out of place, or their mouths warping into horrifying grins. But it gets even crazier than just distortion. Over a quarter of the participants actively hallucinated seeing an entirely different entity in the glass.
Right, 28% to be exact. They reported their reflection being entirely replaced by the face of an old, haggard woman or an unknown, pale child, or a scary, demonic being either hovering directly over their shoulder or staring back at them from inside the mirror.
That is just incredible. The brain literally manufactures a monster out of thin air because the lighting is bad, your neurons are tired, and the visual cortex is trying to aggressively guess what should be there. If you take this clinical data and link it back to the sleepover folklore, the entire ritual makes perfect sense. You step into that cramped, dark bathroom expecting to see a terrifying monster because your older sister just spent an hour filling your head with the urban legend of a bloodthirsty witch. Your heart is racing, your sympathetic nervous system is flooded with adrenaline. You lock eyes with yourself in the glass, Troxler's fading kicks in, the edges of your face melt away, your brain demands to know what is in the shadows, and your fatigued, terrified visual cortex obligingly paints the exact monster you were expecting to see right over your own reflection.
It is a stunning, elegant piece of biological psychology. The ghost in the mirror is not a demon, and it is not a tutor queen. It is actually just you. It is your own highly suggestible mind filling in the blanks in the dark, violently projecting your own subconscious fears onto a piece of silver-backed glass.
It is the ultimate, the call is coming from inside the house scenario. Your brain is the haunted house.
Exactly. And honestly, when you step back and look at the totality of what we've discussed today, this neurological phenomenon serves as the absolute perfect poetic metaphor for Queen Mary Tudor herself.
Oh, that's such a good point.
Think about what the mechanics of history did to her legacy. Society took a real reflection, a complex, deeply traumatized, chronically ill, profoundly flawed woman who was just struggling to survive in a brutally misogynistic, violent world. And they projected their own monstrous political fears right over her face. They painted over her reality with graphic woodcuts and propaganda until a two-dimensional monster was all anyone could see.
Wow. That really brings the entire journey full circle. We started this deep dive shivering in a childhood bathroom, terrified of an urban legend. And we went from a simple sleepover dare to unraveling the incredibly dense, tragic life of a Tudor queen. We looked at the agonizing reality of 16th century endometriosis, the toxic life-or-death familial politics of King Henry VIII, the sheer psychological devastation of the phantom pregnancies, and the post-mortem PR smear campaign orchestrated by her victors. And we grounded it all in the actual neuroscience of how our own visual cortex creates hallucinations in the dark.
It is a powerful, sobering reminder of how historical legends are actually born. They don't spring from the supernatural. They are forged from the very real horrors, political machinations, and tragic complexities of the human experience.
Absolutely. So the next time you find yourself stumbling into a dark bathroom in the middle of the night, catching your reflection in a dim mirror, and you feel that sudden primal spike of fear in your chest, remember the science. Your brain is just playing a predictive trick on you. And more importantly, remember the history. Remember that the monster you are so afraid of summoning wasn't a demon at all. She was just a woman in an unimaginable amount of physical and emotional pain who was used, abused, and ultimately betrayed by almost everyone she ever loved.
I think to truly, fully put Mary's tragedy into its final perspective, we have to look at how her story concludes in the physical, geographical world, not just in the pages of a history book. We know from the Royal Archives that Mary's explicit dying wish was to be buried peacefully alongside her beloved mother, Catherine of Aragon. But like almost everything else in her life, that comfort was denied to her. Instead, Mary was interred beneath the stone floor of Westminster Abbey.
Which, to a modern ear, sounds like a prestigious honor until you hear the devastating footnote to that arrangement.
Right, because when her half-sister, Queen Elizabeth I, died several decades later after a long celebrated reign, the Protestant government made a highly symbolic decision. They decided to bury Elizabeth in the exact same tomb. They lowered Elizabeth's coffin directly on top of Mary's. And if you walk into Westminster Abbey today as a tourist, you will see a massive, glorious, soaring marble monument adorned with statues and heraldry dedicated entirely to Elizabeth, celebrating her triumphant golden age. And Mary's commemorated only by a simple, easily overlooked black marble slab on the floor, completely overshadowed and, quite literally, physically crushed beneath the immense weight of this sister who stole her kingdom, her legacy, and her historical reputation. It really forces you to ask the question. If you want to know what true, inescapable purgatory looks like, is it being trapped inside a bathroom mirror for eternity as a child's ghost story? Or is it spending the rest of recording time buried beneath the very person who destroyed your life?